So good afternoon, and on behalf of the Plains Indians Pioneers Museum, the board, and the staff here at the museum, I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for taking a part of your Saturday afternoon to come here and hear our speaker today. I'm Robin Howeiler. I'm the director of, listen to me, I'm in charge of social media and anything else that comes along that nobody else wants to do. David, our speaker, and I met about a year ago. He was coming through town. He gave a talk at the Woodward Rotary and was headed over to Gage to speak to their Rotary Club. And he stopped into the museum, and I had heard of Dick Morgan. Anyone who read Louise Jane's book, Below Devil's Gap, knew that name. She did a nice piece in there about him. So I was familiar with him. And David talked to me about maybe coming to the museum and giving a presentation. And it occurred to me then that was a good thing. It would be a good thing. We tend to focus on the more flamboyant and dangerous characters who roam through this part of the world prior to statehood. But I did some checking, and I did not find any instances in which Dick Morgan ever carried a gun. He almost certainly didn't shoot it out in a saloon anywhere. He did not land in jail, break out, go on the lam to Montana, and then send money back to get the local newspaper sent to him up there. And the other thing that struck me about Dick Morgan was he was just one of life's overachievers. He had his entire lifetime was dedicated to serving, and in a number of ways. He was a 6-term congressman, and I'll stop babbling here.
Go on, this is better than my talk.
So our speaker today, David Morgan, is Dick Morgan's great-grandson. He is a 4th-generation Oklahoman. He is a former teacher and attorney, and worked for 20 years as general counsel for MidFirst Bank in Oklahoma City, and retired.
There's a branch here.
Yeah, he retired about 4 years ago, and he's here to talk about his great-grandfather. So please give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I am just super excited about being here in Woodward. It's a place that my great-grandfather called it home for the longest time. He was in Oklahoma from 1904 until he died in 1920. But before I get started, I better introduce my beautiful wife of 50 years. Now, she will try to tell you she was 6 when we got married. But I can assure you, I would not have married a 6-year-old. But before we get started today, I passed out a song. And this has a Woodward connection. And I would like to have some help singing this song today. Anybody game? Now this is actually written by, first of all, the tune of this song is Yankee Doodle. So everybody knows the tune. Da 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 da, and so on and so forth. Now I can't sing, by the way, so you'll have to help me. But the words are by Margaret Wiggins. I'm not sure exactly who she was, but she was related to a gentleman named Ed Wiggins. And Robin, he had stores here and furniture stores and stuff. He was also at one time the receiver of the U.S. Land Office when it was first, sometime probably in the early 1900s. So this was a campaign song that Margaret, who was probably I think it was either Ed's sister or daughter. I don't know which one for sure. I'm going to do some research on that. But she wrote the words for him. This is for his 1912 campaign. for Congress. He had already been elected twice in 1908 and 1910. So, everybody game? Okay, oh, and by the way, the words are on the back because they're a little bit hard to see. I typed those for you. So, again, to the tune of Yankee Doodle, everybody help me. Now, Johnny J and Dickie T are in the race for Congress. The people cried, "'Tis hard to say which one will be supported." And no one knows until that day which one will be defeated. And now see here, this is what I say. I'll do my best again, sir. Then up again in time did try to win the nomination. And in this town the people cried, "Do vote for Dick T. Morgan, for he's the man that treats us right from one week to another. So vote again the way you did, he'll win the nomination. A big day will be held again on which there will be speaking. So come in here, dear friend," said he, "what I have done for Woodward. And on that day you'll welcome be, so come and push for Morgan, for he's a man to win again, and push for Woodward people."
Wow.
Surprisingly, thank you guys very much. Surprisingly, I haven't heard that song since 1912. But anyway, my real story for this starts in. Oh, I do want to mention the book that Robin mentioned. Excuse me there. Because I guess my question is, what was behind this man that Margaret wrote this song for? Well, Robin mentioned it. You all know this book, Devil's Gap. Louise James talks about Dick Morgan, and she calls him the strongest political figure in Woodward at this time. And of course, last year, the Plains Museum, in their publication, The Red Earth, said there is no one in territorial and post-statehood Oklahoma that comes close to matching the accomplishments of the lifetime of service of Dick Thompson Morgan. So that's where I came up with the top, a lifetime of service. But my story actually starts in Guthrie, not in Woodward.
It's the sign.
There we go. 1889, April 22nd. Remember the date? The 89ers come to Guthrie, 50,000 people make the run. Now on your map that I gave you, some people forget that the first land run was just a very small portion of Oklahoma. Just where it says unassigned lands right in the center, it's about 5% of what the state is now. So only about 3,500 square miles actually were involved in that first land run. And 10,000 people landed in Guthrie on that first day. Also 10,000 in Oklahoma City. Can you imagine 10,000 people? Well, if you can imagine 10,000 people all coming at one time, imagine this. Here's one of them. It's Dick T. Morgan. This comes from an Oklahoma history book that was written in 1890. It's got to be one of the oldest history books after Oklahoma Territory was established. And this is what Dick T. Morgan looked like at age 35. Now the funny thing about the 10,000 people in Guthrie is that first month in Guthrie, there were over 200 attorneys in Guthrie. I always get a laugh about that. What would 200 attorneys be doing in one little spot like Guthrie, Oklahoma? Well, of course, they were all there to represent the homesteaders. Everybody's really trying to do the same thing, help the homesteaders make their claims. But one of those 214 was Dick T. Morgan. He looks like any other attorney at that time. Got a handsome little mustache and a little goatee beard. Handsome guy. I think he looked like a little bit like I did at that age. So Ellen wouldn't let me have the facial hair, except for that. But there was something special about him. And over the next 15 years, he would represent more homesteaders than any other attorney in Oklahoma Territory. And we're going to talk about how he got to that spot. After statehood, of course, he served 6, and I use the word distinguished terms in the U.S. Congress. I think you'll agree with me of some of the accomplishments he had. And of course, we talked about the quote from the Red Earth publication last year. What were his traits? Well, Robin mentioned some of those. He was an overachiever. But what he really did is he would just outwork people. He would just spend hours and hours learning what he needed to know. And he was also a very natural leader. I don't know where that trait got lost between him and me, but somehow that got lost. Anytime he would go into a group, whether it was a Republican group he was a party of, a church group, a civic group, he would invariably become the president of that group. And we'll have many, many examples today of where he did that. But maybe it was because of number 3. He was passionate and he stood by his convictions. He loved the homesteaders. He loved the farmers. He loved the people of Northwest Oklahoma. Loved the soldiers, the veterans. But mostly he just really liked to serve people. That was probably his best trait. It all started back in Indiana, Prairie Creek, Indiana. You may know the geography of Indiana. You know where Terre Haute is, right on the Wabash River. This is about 15 miles south of Terre Haute. Family of farmers. The first thing they do when you're born, they put your name in the Bible. Kind of sweet, isn't it? Makes you feel kind of special. Here he is, Dick Thompson Morgan, December 6, 1853. What a great historical time when you think of his lifetime. 1853, the pre-Civil War, right before the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right before the Dred Scott decision, before Harriet Tubman wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, into the Civil War, and all the way up until his life, until after World War I. If you just want to read American history, just want to learn American history, just think of those years of his life and what that covered and how the U.S. changed. You know, nonetheless, Oklahoma, but just how the U.S. changed during that time. They were a family of farmers. They had a nice spread. They had about 400 acres of farmland. That's why I guess they had to have 9 kids to work the farmland. But they were also very well educated. And they were very politically astute, I'll say. In fact, my great-grandfather was named after the most prominent Whig Republican in Terre Haute, a man by the name of Richard Thompson. So he had politics in his blood from the minute he was born. He was kind of destined to do something in politics. Civil War comes up. He's 7 years old. Let's talk about leadership for a minute. What can you do when you're 7 years old? Family is very pro-union, very anti-slavery, very much supportive of Abraham Lincoln's effort to keep the Union together. But you're 7 years old, what can you do? Well, he decided that if he learned how to play the tenor drums, that when the home guard troops would march through town, he could talk himself into marching in front of the troops as they were parading through town. 60 years later, when he's writing his memoirs, the first story he remembers about his life is playing the tenor drums, and in his mind, leading the troops, the Union troops, to Civil War. Now that's leadership, isn't it? And there he is, not just behind the troops, but actually leading them. This is his family, by the way. This is he right here, probably about age 15. His little sister, his older brothers are about 10 years older than he is. But, like I said, he did well in Indiana. In fact, before he left Indiana, I've got to get him to Oklahoma, or we'll be here all day. He actually served 1 term in the state legislature in Indiana. He was elected when he was 26 years old. By that time, he'd already had 3 college degrees, graduated first in his law school class, had been a county superintendent of schools, And again, he's 26 years old, he serves one term in the legislature. This is when he was a student in college. This has no significance except this is what my hair used to look like. So. Back in the good old days. But let's get him on to Oklahoma. We talked about him coming to Guthrie along with 213 other attorneys. He's got to do something to stand out. He wants to be the best homestead attorney in Oklahoma. So first thing he did, sorry Rob, I'm walking away from your camera, is he writes a book. And this, by the way, is on display out front. But this is a book that he wrote called Oklahoma, called Morgan's Manual of Homestead Law. You know, if you had ancestors back in any of the land runs, there's a good chance they would have had this book or borrowed it from a neighbor. Had 5 editions to it. Sold over 20,000 copies in that 10-year period. That's a lot of copies in the 1890s to 1900. The really good thing about this book was it was a how-to book, how to make your claim. And some of the people in the room probably remember reading Oklahoma history, about half the land claims were in dispute. So it's very important you knew how to do that right. The other good thing is, on page 1 of this is like the 5th edition, there's an endorsement from the Secretary of the Interior. This was the book they used in the U.S. Land Office. This was kind of, it's almost like you had an answer sheet ahead of time. If you did it the way that Dick Morgan prescribed, then when you went to the Land Office to validate your claims, they were using the same book that you would have used. It would really have helped out. So this became kind of his bellwether start to becoming to representing more homesteaders than any other attorney. The other thing he did, and I know we have some members, at least a couple of members of the First Christian Church, he was very active in the church in Oklahoma Territory. When he came to Guthrie, he had actually come by way of Garden City, Kansas. He set up the very first Christian church service in Guthrie that evolved into the First Christian Church of Guthrie on May 5th, 1889. When he moved to Perry 4 years later for that land run, one that we're involved in Woodward, he also helped set up the very first church service in Perry the day after the run. But most importantly, he organized an organization called the Oklahoma Christian Missionary Society that governed all the Christian churches in Oklahoma Territory, helped found them. He would have been involved in 1902 in setting up the Christian church in Woodward. He was president of that organization for 15 years, the only president it ever had. That's like I say, he goes places, he immediately becomes kind of in charge of that. He also, the other thing he would do, he would move from place to place. He would go where the action was. Starts in Guthrie, moves to Perry for this land run. One of the 3 land offices for this land run was in Perry, one was in Alva, and one was in Woodward. And then he moved down to El Reno. They had a big land lottery for all this land down here. Now in Guthrie, he had his office right across the street from the land office. If you walked out of the land office door and walked across the street on 2nd Street in Guthrie, you would walk right into his office. He wanted to be at eye level with his clients. In Perry, again, we have a picture of his office in Perry. Can't tell for sure that's his office. I blew this up. There he is, Morgan and Pancos, land attorneys. Always nearby the land office. Listen to this. In El Reno, he moved there. El Reno was already an established town by 1901. They'd already been parts of 2 land runs. In that case, he bought a building and leased part of the space in the building to the U.S. Land Office. He wanted to make sure he was where the action was. Oh, this is interesting too. We have a letterhead from 1902 in El Reno. He had 12 branch offices in Oklahoma. Now that takes some work to set up and manage 12 branch offices. He also would advertise all over the U.S., urging people to come to Oklahoma. But he would also say in his advertisement, if you can't come right now, send me $1, and guess what I'll send you? A little book. That's how he sold 20,000 copies all over the country. Or he also said, if you want a map also, send me an extra quarter, extra 2 bits, and I'll send you a map too. He also had a law office in Chicago, and 2 in South Dakota. An overachiever, as Robin said. He wanted to be where the action was. This is his office in South Dakota. This, by the way, is my grandfather and his new bride, my grandmother. This is 1904. He was at Columbia Law School at the time, my grandfather was, and they had just been married like less than a year. They had met at Drake University, which of course is a Disciple of Christ Christian University in Des Moines, Iowa. What he really wanted to do, though, he was here at 35, 36 years old. He wanted to be territorial governor. He thought he was qualified. And he knew Benjamin Harrison, who was president of the United States, who was going to appoint the governor. Now, how do you know Harrison? Well, back in Indiana, back in 1880, I guess, U.S. senators, remember, were elected by the legislature, not by the people. And he was a member of that legislature at age 26 that elected Harrison as U.S. Senator. And I think because of his youth back then, he was chosen to give one of the 2 nominating speeches for Benjamin Harrison. So he thought he had an in with the president. And he scurried up to Washington by train when he realized that Oklahoma had become a territory. He wanted to be that first governor. He met according to newspaper reports, he met with the president. The first question Harrison asked him, said, Dick, were you there when Oklahoma was opened? Because Oklahoma had been kind of a lawless place when it first opened. He said, yes, sir, I was. He said, well, I hate to tell you this, but I'm bringing in somebody who was not there because we need more discipline, more laws. It's too chaotic there. And the president thought it would be bad to have somebody who was kind of on site then. Of course, by doing that, he disqualified a lot of attorneys in Oklahoma Territory for that. The person he chose there was a former 4-term congressman from Indiana who had been a Civil War general who was told to go in there and create order out of disorder. But the good news is, while he was up there, he wrote a letter to his wife. And this is one of my favorite letters of the hundreds that I've seen from the wife and the husband together. This is what he says, and he's kind of down to dump, being told he's not going to be governor. While I'm away from you, I think much of you and about how good you are, and what a treasure a man has who has a good, true, loving wife, and how great a pleasure it should be for a man to do all in his power to repay this goodness, love, and faithfulness. So I resolve to try harder in the future to please my good wife, whether I succeed or not in securing the appointment I seek. This is Valentine's week. What a great letter for Valentine's. To remind your wife that, did I tell you all that last night?
Pretty much.
Pretty much. I just bring that out, just to give word to her about once a week, so just for her to remember. By the way, we went to Al's for Valentine's Day last night. It was really good. Rob was, not Robin, but Rob was there last night. So he was fun. Anybody go to Al's last night? Last night?
Yeah, for lunch.
Oh, for lunch, okay. We should have come back at 5. It was packed at 5 o'clock. So they wouldn't take reservations, so they had to have it. But those are the kind of things we've been able to find about doing the research about him, things where he was, just such personal stuff. But he was very involved in politics. I'm going to skip over the Free Homes Act, although it's a very important part of it, and we can talk about it. We have some extra time where everybody has an issue about later. But one of the big issues in Oklahoma was statehood. Is Oklahoma going to become 1 or 2 states? After the Civil War, the 5 tribes lost about half their land through treaties because they had aligned with the Confederacy. That's what kind of opened a lot of Oklahoma. But Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory from 1860 to 1907 developed very separately. Oklahoma Territory was organized in 1890 with a governor, a Supreme Court, legislature, counties, school systems, school funding, etc. It had grown to be 700,000 people were living in Oklahoma Territory alone, just the western part of the state. They wanted their own state. Most people, like my great-grandfather, wanted a separate state. They started petitioning Congress for a separate Oklahoma Territory state as early as 1891. They were really into that. For 15 years they tried to get that. But they were told by the Republicans in Congress there would not be two states. There'd be one state. Oklahoma Territory must combine with Indian Territory and become one state. The same discussions were going on with Indian Territory. They wanted either to be no state, or remain governed by the tribes, or become their own separate state. In fact, many of you all know that the Indian Territory petitioned Congress to become the state of Sequoia with their own constitution in 1905, 1906, along in there. So, but Congress told both territories they had to become one state. And the first thing they did was have to write a constitution. The Constitution was mainly written by Democrats. They had dominated the politics for the Constitutional Convention. Dick Morgan, the Republican, had a 42-page speech opposing the Constitution. They gave all over the state. Back then, people would talk 2 hours. Those were the average. You didn't have the 15-second snippets like we do now. But he was opposed to the Constitution, and he had three main reasons that I'll run through real quickly. He thought, and these were all topical today. We hear about gerrymandering, the drawing of lines in certain places to favor one party or one race over the other. First thing in his speech, he said the Democrats have resorted to every method to make the legislature perpetually Democratic. They did a pretty good job of it. Republicans did not really get into the legislature's control until almost 100 years later, maybe 80 or 90 years later. He also was concerned that Oklahoma, by their constitution, was going to discourage business from coming in and investing in Oklahoma. And he also was concerned that the Constitution as written was very discriminatory towards blacks, other minorities, which of course it was. And many of the laws that were written back then had to be declared unconstitutional. But of course the Constitution was approved by the people. Republicans made one last effort to convince Teddy Roosevelt as president not to approve it. But he finally just said, you know, the people voted on it, if that's what they want. And they took out some very obnoxious language on race relations, that he went ahead and proclaimed statehood. The next thing he was concerned about in Oklahoma, the year after statehood, Oklahoma adopted what was known as the Grandfather Clause Amendment. Anybody know kind of what the Grandfather Clause was? That basically set up a very hard literacy test for everybody, but then it exempted everybody whose ancestors were eligible to vote before the Civil War. So if you had a grandparent who could have voted, you did not have to take the literacy test. If you were African American and you didn't have a grandfather who was eligible to vote, you had to take this test, and basically it meant there are no black votes. He spoke against that. This is still going on today. Who gets to vote? He thought an election law should enable people to vote, not keep people from voting. Now that sounds more like 2007 than 1907. And he also talked about it becomes dangerous when you start telling people who can vote and who can't vote. You start disenfranchising people. But again, the Grandfather Clause Law Amendment was passed by this time by a vote of the people. And of course, it was almost immediately declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. But in spite of these setbacks, Oklahoma became a state on November, 16th, 1907. And Dick T. Morgan was elected. Oh, let me go back to this congressional district, number 2. There were 5 districts set up that included Woodward and included all the way from Oklahoma City all the way through the Panhandle. That was District 2. He was elected from that district in 1908, 1910. 1912 was still there, the campaign song we sung together. Then the map was changed, and this became the 8th, it would have became part of the 8th district. This is the one that a lot of us may remember that our parents would have been in. This was from 1910 to about 1940. It's called the Old 8th District. It was really the only Republican district in the state. All the other districts had a pretty wide majority of Democrat voters. But he was elected to Congress. He went to Congress and became a progressive Republican. You don't hear those words together much anymore. But in 1910, 1912, he introduced the Federal Trade Commission. He gave the first speech on the floor of the House with the Federal Trade Commission. That's probably one of the 3 or 4 most important pieces of legislation in the first quarter of the 20th century. 1913, he introduced a law that would have set up a bank deposit guarantee. This was not adopted for another 20 years under the FDR New Deal program as part of the FDIC legislation. So he's 20 years ahead of his time trying to set up a bank deposit guarantee. He also was one of the sponsors of the Rural Credits Act. There's a book out front in the case or I would have had it with me, called Land Credits, A Plea for the American Farmer. In 1915, for some reason, Congress took an 8-month vacation. And I know some of you say, well, how about doing that again? Go home for 8 months. But during that 8 months, my great-grandfather wrote a 300-page book about farm credits. And basically, he studied farm credit all over the world, even in South America, Europe, the history of the American people. And he wrote this 300-page book that's out front. He gave a copy of that book to every member of the House and the Congress, House and the Senate. They came back, they had his ideas about farm credit. As a result of that, they passed the act, and he was invited to the signing in the Oval Office. Here we have President Wilson, who's a Democrat, by the way. Here we have, back here guarding the flowers, I guess, is my great-grandfather. And I've read all the debates in Congress about the Rural Credits Act. He spoke more than anybody else did about the Rural Credits Act. In fact, one of the funny things about the debates is one day he kept asking to be recognized, and kept with a gentleman from Missouri, please yield to me, how you'd have to do in Congress. And finally, he asked one time too often, would you please yield to me? And this congressman from Pennsylvania said, no, I won't yield to you. You've already said 10 times more than anybody else on here. And which, kind of a rebuke. But then a friend of his behind him said, yeah, but he knows 10 times more than anybody. So anyway, yeah, they had at least one fan in Congress. Everything changed in 1917. U.S. came into the World War I, which had been going on for 2 or 3 years. This is not a personal picture. This is one I just pulled off the internet. Here's President Wilson in first week of April, asking Congress for a declaration of war. And you can imagine the first thing they had to do, the hardest vote of his life in Congress, without none, was the vote for the Selective Service Act, the draft. In fact, Dick Morgan actually came out against the draft at first. He was so concerned about just taking people off their farms, out of the city, into Europe in war, just didn't seem right to him. And plus he thought that it would be better to have a volunteer army. And he was probably correct, except we needed to raise 4 million troops. And I think he must have been convinced by the army, or the armed services, you couldn't get 4 million troops by volunteer. So within about 3 weeks, he agreed to support the draft. Once he supported the draft, he was kind of all in. A year after the war started, he gave a stirring speech in Congress to support Woodrow Wilson's war efforts. As you would expect, there's a lot of people, particularly in the Republican Party, who were backbiting the president. And Dick Morgan, in his congressional speech, said, you know, once you're in war, there's only one person who really has the power to conduct a war, and that's the President of the United States. And we have to support him. We're not Republicans, we're not Democrats. We're not Easterners and Westerners. Everybody's in the same place. If we don't win this war, it doesn't really matter what happens otherwise. He also introduced a soldier civil rights bill. This had nothing to do with rights, civil rights. This had to do with, once you'd taken those people from America and forced them to go to Europe, he introduced a law where you could not then sue that person for a home foreclosure or a debt or some kind. It wasn't fair, he thought, to send a person to war and then have them subject to civil lawsuits. Now, his bill he introduced was watered down, and there were exceptions made to the final bill, but he was the first one to introduce. That law is still in effect today, that he introduced in 1917. After the war, there were 82 proposals about giving benefits to soldiers. The one the soldiers liked the best, the one the veterans liked the best, American Legion, veteran groups, was Morgan's Home for Soldiers bill. It was talked about on the front page of the New York Times in 1919. It was featured in the Saturday Evening Post. Some of you remember the Saturday Evening Post, probably the most important magazine of the time. And basically what his bill did that nobody else did is it allowed the soldiers to stay where they were, stay in Oklahoma, Nebraska, wherever they were, and get if you were honorably discharged, you could get up to a $4,000 loan at a low interest rate, guaranteed by the government, for long term. His proposal actually proposed a 60-year mortgage. And of course that wasn't passed. In fact, we did very little for the soldier after World War I, practically nothing. But 25 years later, if you read the VA loan bill, the same concept that he had introduced in 1919 was adopted in the middle of, I think, 1943, in the middle of World War II. And of course, millions of people over the years have taken advantage of that VA loan. I assume thousands in the Woodward County area. So he's always a man kind of ahead of his time, always a leader. This is his family. He only had one child, whose name since he was named after a politician, he named his son after the governor of Indiana, a guy named Albert Porter, and he named his son Porter. But this is my father, whose name is Porter also. He's about 2. This is probably within about a year before he died. His family was living in Oklahoma City. This was his wife, Orietta. Someone said she looked kind of stern. I think his parents kept telling him you need to have a serious girlfriend. So he got one. Didn't she look serious? No, that's supposed to be a joke. But he was very passionate trying to get this Morgan's Home for Soldiers in 1920. Congress adjourned in June of 1920 for about 6 months. Everybody was going to go home. They had the elections. Everybody was expecting a Republican landslide. Dick Morgan was the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. It was expected that he would be the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And we know from the last month how important it is to be chairman of the Judiciary Committee. But before he went home, he decided to travel to Ottawa, Canada, via Niagara Falls. Took a little time off with his wife in Niagara Falls, went to Ottawa. Ottawa's the capital of Canada. He went to study veteran benefits of Canada and see what they were doing. Canada was doing a lot more than the U.S. was for their veterans. On his way home, he stopped down by his wife's family who lived in Covington, Indiana, just right almost on the border of Illinois, and he became ill. Dick became ill. And he was rushed over to, gave my story away, he died. He's still here today. He was rushed over to Danville, Illinois. Brand new hospital, been built the year before. Checked in, he died 3 hours later. It was July 4th, 1920. His body was taken by train to Oklahoma City. He was met by the governor of Oklahoma. That was on a Sunday. He died. It was on Thursday. His body was taken to the state capitol, where it was laid in state for the afternoon of Thursday. The next day, the funeral was held at First Christian Church, another Disciple of Christ church, where I grew up. And he was interred in Rose Hill Cemetery, which is our family cemetery. This was an obituary from the Woodward Democrat on July 9th, 1920. And unfortunately, I thought I had brought some of the narrative of that. But it was, even though it was an opposition newspaper, obviously, it was very complimentary of reminding people how he lived his life, even though he was in the opposite party. One of the things that I was giving this talk to the Oklahoma history staff about 3 or 4 months ago, maybe even longer than that. And one of the directors there, came up to me afterwards. He said, as you were telling that story about the end of his life, he said, I kept thinking back to the little boy who was marching in front of the troops and what he was thinking at that time. And at that time when he was marching around those troops, he wouldn't have even known about Oklahoma. The word Oklahoma didn't exist. That was Indian territory. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't know that while he was doing that, Congress was passing, the Republican Congress was passing the Railroad Act that was going to tie the country together. That Congress was passing the Homestead Act that he would later become the expert on. All he knew was that in the moment he was there, he wanted to do something important. And by the grace of God, or by just the quirk of fate, those things that were happening while he was doing that followed him and circled back and caught up with him in Oklahoma. And he was still basically doing the same things throughout those 30 years in Oklahoma that he had done when he was leading the troops through Prairie Creek Village, Indiana. So I thank you all very much for having me here. I always kind of rush through this. If anybody has any questions or comments, or people have ancestors who were there.
I was wondering what happened to him. Did we know how he died, or?
He had lobar pneumonia. And the paper, by the way, suggested that it was probably from going to Canada, Ottawa, down to Indiana, it was probably a change of the weather that caused that. It's probably something that could have been easily cured today, although I guess people still die of pneumonia. He was 66 years old, seemed to be in very good health. As far as there's nothing we've seen in our research that said he was in any type of bad health, and he was coming here to basically campaign for his 7th term. Would have been a sure victory. The Republican Party, as we know, had a landslide election in 1920. It was actually the only time in about the first 40 years of Oklahoma Republicans actually won a few offices statewide at that time. and picked up a couple of congressional seats on, seats that were normally Democratic. People had gotten kind of tired of the Democrats, Woodrow Wilson, but pneumonia was a cause of death. And we know a little bit about what happened that last 2 or 3 days because of newspaper articles and then letters that were written back and forth and telegrams, kind of what the timing was on that final death. One interesting story about his death is, if you haven't heard of this book, was a guy called the Okie Jesus Congressman. You've heard of the Okie Jesus Congressman, I'm sure. This guy thought he was Jesus Christ. He was from Perry, Oklahoma, and he was the only person who ran against Dick T. Morgan in the 1920 Republican primary, and therefore when Morgan died, by default, he became the candidate for the Republican Party. Republicans tried to replace him, but the Oklahoma Supreme Court, mostly all Democratic, would not let them, and he actually won the election. And this book is called The Okie Jesus Congressman, The Life of Manuel Herrick. He was named Manuel because his mother thought he was Jesus. And he went through life thinking he was the second coming of Christ, and finally died in an insane asylum in California. But again, Quirk, the real candidate for that year would have been a Woodwardite named Charles Swindle, not sure exactly name, who won the next election and was a congressman for several terms, a very well-known lawyer and politician from Woodward at that time. Did you like my song? That was 1912 was the election where Teddy Roosevelt tried to come back and unseat William Howard Taft. So you had a four-man race. You had Taft, who was president, Roosevelt, who was ex-president, who had handpicked Taft as his successor. You got Woodrow Wilson, who had been president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey, was a dark horse candidate. Then you had this fourth, Eugene Debs, who ran 4 times as a socialist, who was from Terre Haute, Indiana, and lived 2 blocks from Dick T. Morgan when they were in their 20s. So they would have known each other. And of course, the last time Eugene Debs ran for president, he ran from prison. He had been convicted under the Alien Sedition Act during World War I and was in prison for talking against the war. And back then, you couldn't talk against the war or the draft. You would actually go to jail for it. So that's a real well-known election. The other book I would suggest you read, if you're interested in some recommendations. This was Book of the Year at the Oklahoma History Center last year. I know I'm doing something crazy up there. It's called Alfalfa Bill, about Alfalfa Bill Murray. The author of this book right now is doing research on Dick T. Morgan and perhaps may do a book about him. Now, if you're interested in the statehood politics, Progressive Oklahoma. I mean, if you really like Oklahoma history, this is a great, all the things you talk about statehood, the Constitutional Convention, the progressive movement is a really good book. And then the one we talked about, the church work he did, and Dick T. Morgan's mentioned this book. This is the history. This is called Oklahoma Christians, and it's the history of the Disciple of Christ Church in Oklahoma. And I think the church here, First Christian Church here, as I recall, has a copy. There's a copy of this book. But probably can overlook it. But anyway, any other comments? Any land run ancestors? They might have had his book. Who knows? Well, appreciate it very much for all this time, and invite you to really have a good Valentine's weekend.